itching to talk about Virginia Tech on this show for a while now, mainly because I think it's one of the most underrated atmospheres in the entire country. When you hear Enter Sandman, whether it's on the television or in person, that's always a fun sight to see too. But also, Blacksburg is just such a beautiful place, and I'd love to go see a game there. Unfortunately, this season it didn't quite pan out with the Vanderbilt game, and then obviously it was much more anticipated that Clemson and versus Virginia Tech would be a game that could possibly decide even the fate of the ACC. But Virginia Tech lost a couple of games, and then once when that kind of all fell apart, didn't really work out. But now we're looking at Virginia Tech, and they lost the Mayo Bowl last year, so they were 6-7. Then the year before they were 7-6. And then they had a rough, rocky start, going 3-8 in their first year. Brett Pry replaced Justin Fuente. Before that, he was with Penn State for about 7 seasons, 5 of those as a defensive coordinator. So the guys earned his stripes, and also, for anyone who knows on the show, definitely a Penn State guy. So I guess I'm a little bit biased when it comes to that too, right? But now that we're looking at Virginia Tech and we're kind of asking ourselves, how are they looking this year? And one thing I have to say is I'm not nearly on the Virginia Tech bandwagon as I was last year. I think this time last year, at least for a lot of people, but including myself, I was definitely sitting there saying, hey, I think Virginia Tech can definitely make some noise in the ACC, just given how wide open it was. Because, again, we were talking about this last year, and the teams to look for were, Florida State, Clemson, and Miami, and then Virginia Tech. Whereas now Virginia Tech is still kind of in that sort of 6 to 8 win, 5 to 8 win bubble, kind of what they've been in the past 2 seasons. But now the expectations, I think, are just a different conversation now, because I sit there and I look at this Virginia Tech team, and when I watched them this past season, well, first off, I say to myself, hey, they are losing a lot of productivity, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. They don't have nearly as many. They have a lot of seniors who are not coming back or graduating too or transferred. And quite frankly, I mean, the defensive side of the ball, they did their best to make it work. And we still don't really know what happened with Chris Mave and Brett Pry. We don't know if it was a, disagreement, or if it was just simply a changing of the guard, or if he, or if he essentially fired him. But even though I think a lot of the Hokie fan base kind of put the blame on Mave a lot of the time, I really don't think it was all on him. I think there were a lot of instances where Virginia Tech's defense in many ways kind of had to bail out the offense in some regard, because the offense was just so inconsistent throughout the year too, especially when you have a guy like Drones who, is the guy that can be a legitimate difference maker. But it's been such an erratic and inconsistent offense that's really kind of hard to put your finger on it too. But I think there's a couple of different factors here that are not really working right now, and that definitely need to be fixed ASAP if they really have any chance. I mean, first and foremost, the offensive line was just simply atrocious. I mean, it got to a point where if Jones was sitting there for more than 4 seconds, he really pretty much either had to get rid of the ball or he had to scramble outside of the pocket and kind of hope for the best. And it doesn't help too that Virginia Tech loses their top 2 receivers this season. And now on top of their wide receiver room already being pretty thin, they're going to be asking out of a lot of younger guys to kind of step up and, take that next step. But, from what I saw last year, they were essentially relying on Drones to pretty much be the catalyst to any sort of offense production whatsoever. Then when he had a stinger or two, it just was left muddling. And you have to sit there and wonder too, what's the depth going to be like at the wide receiver room and in the offensive line? Because I think a lot of the ACC is going to be sitting there chomping at the bit, saying to themselves, hey, this Virginia Tech team is somewhat vulnerable. They didn't necessarily have a bad recruiting class, but it wasn't anything necessarily spectacular. I mean, we go back in 2024, they were ranked 31st. 2025, they were ranked 39th. So it's not a terrible stretch or anything. But I mean, a top 40 recruiting class is always solid too. I think Brett Pry that's one of the reasons why they brought him in, is because he's always been a solid recruiter. I mean, Virginia Tech is in many ways very, very similar to Penn State. I mean, he knows how to sell the program. He knows what the strengths are. He knows what the weaknesses are. He has, for the most part, the support of the administration too, which always helps too. But we are kind of definitely at the point now where you get to season 4, and it is somewhat of a make or break season, because if they end up with another 7-6 season, it's gonna leave everybody with some question marks too, especially if Virginia Tech kind of asking themselves, hey, do we give this guy an extension, or do we go out there and try to get somebody better? So it's going to be one of those things where there's a lot riding on Virginia Tech this season, and a great test for them is going to be, just like I talked about on my show the other day. They're going to be starting off against South Carolina and Atlanta, and although everyone's going to be talking about this from South Carolina's perspective, because they are going to be more than likely ranked within the top 15 of the preseason AP poll, this is just as good. This is just as a big deal for Virginia Tech too. You sit there and say to yourself, hey, you're going to have a primetime game in essentially week 0 of college football. So that already gets everybody excited. On top of that too, it's marketing now. You get to a point where, those high school kids are just about to start school. They're going to think about where they're going, or if they're uncommitted, especially, those juniors who could be seniors. And those are going to be the big difference makers. And when you look at this Hokies team, it's just more or less like, can these playmakers step up? Can we get some separation on the outside? Because it wasn't just because of the offensive line, although that was a big part of it, and that ultimately is the reason why we saw some lackluster offensive stats on that front. But also too, when the receivers don't necessarily get the separation that you want to, it leads drones to, kind of messing on the fundamentals sometimes, especially in the footwork, and just kind of being erratic, and also just forcing things that simply aren't there. So I think it's not necessarily just one thing that's going on. It's a multitude of small things that are making it into one bigger thing. And now we're at the point where if Virginia Tech really wants to take the next step, they're really going to have to, kind of take it to the next level and say to themselves, hey, can we turn this team that is essentially a 5 or 6 win team, and can we turn it into a 7 or 8 win team? Because you look at the beginning of their schedule, for the most part, it's relatively comfortable. It's relatively comfortable on the first way, especially if they forgive themselves and beat Vanderbilt at the beginning. But you have, because they when you look at that beginning of the schedule, they have a realistic chance of going 4-1, even 5-1, assuming that they can take care of Wake Forest, and they can perhaps even get an upset versus NC State, which could be end up being their ACC opener, and a program similarly on the ropes, in the sense that, Dave Dorbin, for years and years and years, people have kind of asked, when is the Wolfpack going to take that next step? And Virginia Tech is kind of in that same sort of boat. And for those who have been covering Virginia Tech for decades now, people are longing for that full contender in the ACC, to be a dark horse in that contendership, being able to return some of that production and be able to, finish off the year strong. Because when you have a bunch of production come back from 23, and then you have that disappointment in 24, it kind of makes you ask yourself, is that really the peak of what is going to happen here?